Sponsored by McCams, getting you back on two wheels when it wasn't your fault.
Hello everyone, Rob here on the banks of the Thames in London, overlooking Canary Wharf, and today I've got this lovely Moto Guzzi V9 bobber to tell you all about. Now I've had it for a couple of weeks and I've been mainly using it to get around the city, commuting, filtering, picking my way through the traffic, and I think that's where this bike really excels, but I'll tell you a bit more about that later. Firstly, let's talk about the fundamentals of the bike, and anyone who's seen a Moto Guzzi before will recognise all of this. It's a 90-degree V-twin, 2 valves per cylinder driven by push rods, and it rattles, clanks and rumbles along just like you'd expect. That's through to a single plate dry clutch and then onto a shaft final drive. Now this bike's been available for a couple of years now since it was released, but really it's an increment on the V7 which has been around for a good few years before that. The big headline change to the motor versus the V7 would be the extra 100cc of capacity that it's got, but the performance increases that come as a result of that are quite minor. You only get 3 extra horsepower, so it's up from 52 to 55, and wait for it, peak torque goes from 60 newton meters to 62, so a whole extra 2. But I think the important thing to remember is that that peak torque is now produced much lower down, so 3,000 revs, which is a lot more of a cruisery, relaxed feel as opposed to the 5,000 revs of the V7. The avid bike world viewers amongst you may remember that I went out and tested the Moto Guzzi V85 TT, and that's a really similar motor, same capacity, pretty much the same setup, but that had a whole host of changes to the internals that gave it 80 horsepower. So there's a lot more to be had from that motor, but you've got to remember the V85 is a couple of grand more. It starts at around 11,000. This is about 9 grand. And also this bike is just fundamentally set up for a much more relaxed, easy, tranquil riding style. And I definitely found that myself. I did manage to get out for a day riding on the twisties on a Sunday, out into Kent, into the country lanes. And I found that if you try to rush this bike, bang it through the gears, it doesn't really enjoy it, and nor do you. I think the more that you just learn to ride it smooth and enjoy the fact that you're trying to keep your momentum up, the more satisfying it becomes. It took me a little while to get used to the clutch and the transmission, but once you get riding smoothly, it's really quite enjoyable. And I think a big part of that is the braking as well. So although you might not expect much from this single disc up front, it's a Brembo 4-pot caliper on a 320mm rotor, and I actually found the bite and the progression on the brakes really good, and really good stopping power when you need it as well, so that really enhanced the experience. The suspension is KYB at the front and rear, nice and firm, not too wallowy as you might associate with some other cruisers. No adjustment of course, you've just got preload at the back which will help you set up the stance of the bike if you've got a passenger or luggage or whatever, but it actually handles pretty nicely, and I think that would be contrary to what you'd expect with these 16-inch rims and these big balloon tyres, especially this 130mm wide tyre on the front. It handles nicely. It's no Panigale, but I had a good time all the same out in Kent blasting around. But as I said at the beginning of the video, most of my riding has been in and around town, and it's actually a really practical bike for commuting, for city riding, and I think that is one key strength lies here as well, because really you're going to compare this bike to the likes of the Triumph Bobber, or perhaps consider something like a Harley Sportster if you're looking at this machine. Those bikes come in at about 240 or 250 kilos. This is 199 kilos curb weight, so there's a whole 50 kilos saved there, which is quite a significant amount. I mean, that's a small passenger. So what that means is it's actually really maneuverable and flickable around town when you're filtering between cars, when you're trying to find those little gaps, when perhaps your balance might be a little bit compromised. I found this bike exceptionally easy to ride, especially at lower speeds, especially at full lock, maneuvering between the traffic. Really, really good. I don't know if the centre of gravity is particularly low, but it really felt good at walking pace. It also helps that the seat height is just 785mm, so not at all cramped, and I found the seating position, especially on the long ride back from the Moto Guzzi garage down the motorway a couple of hours, straight away very comfortable. Nice angles of 90 degrees of your hips and your knees and your arms. The bars are nice and flat, lovely position, but at the same time it's low enough that it means you can get both feet down. So if it does come to a standstill and you need to waddle around the cars, easy peasy for even someone with short legs like me. And that can also be extra reassuring if you take a Pillion, which a lot of us city riders do. So I took my wife out a couple of times, dropped her at work and got her opinion. And the thing is, this passenger seat here, there's one bolt under the mudguard, and then this whole thing just lifts out and leaves you with a bit more of a bobber looking bike. I know it doesn't look exactly like a bobber. I'm sure I'm going to get plenty of comments saying it's not a bobber, but it looks a bit more bobber without that pillion seat. But that doesn't mean this pillion seat's an afterthought. It's really nicely cushioned, very comfortable. You've got the strap here as well, which gives you something to hold on to dear life for. And generally, she said it was pretty good, especially the comfort of the shocks. And as I said, they're preload adjustable, so you can get the ride set up nicely for if you're carrying a passenger. The only downside that we found with these seats is the waterproofing. The fabric itself seems totally fine, but the seams along the edge let a bit of water in, and I parked it outside the office for a day. It got drenched and then dried up a little bit, but still, when we jumped on at the end of the day, looked dry, but as soon as your bum squishes down on the seat, it pushes all that water out and you get a wet backside. So it wasn't pleasant for me, and also can't say that my wife enjoyed it that much either. Otherwise, it's a pretty practical bike for around town as well. Not only is it good for a pillion, not only is it good for filtering, but I think there's decent equipment on there. 2-mode traction control and ABS, so if you are riding through winter, you know, you do get a lot of fuel and grit and gravel on the roads in London, and especially when it's wet. Even at low speed with a torquey-ish motor like this, it can get you in a little bit of a pickle, so that's reassuring. I also really like the inclusion of a USB port on the headstock here. That's a nice spot for it. On my own bike, Triumph Street Twin, it's under the saddle, and I believe that's the same on the V7 as well. This just makes way more sense for casual use. If you're not going to run a cable under the tank and you're just going to use this as and when you need it, then this is absolutely great. I also like the clock and the little digital display in there. So it's got a retro look to it, being a round analog clock that gives you speed, but you've also got a small digital readout with plenty of functionality. So that's quite nice as well. I mean, the only massive oversight here is that it doesn't have a fuel gauge, and I think for a £9,000 bike you would expect that. You could argue when I'm talking about city riding that there's a lot of petrol stations dotted around, but the problem is then you stop planning ahead so much, and I've certainly not been in the habit of thinking of it, and the fuel warning lights come on a few times and taken me by surprise. So I would have liked to have seen a fuel gauge there, and also the gear position indicator doesn't show a number until you release the clutch, which has taken me a little bit of getting used to. Those sorts of things might not put you off if you've got your heart set on this bike, but they're just little niggles that I noticed anyway. All in all though, I've really enjoyed riding this bike for a couple of weeks, really had a lot of fun on it, both in town and out of town, and as I said, the motorway riding is pretty easy as well. I think it's definitely going to appeal to those who already like their Moto Guzzis. If you don't and you've not considered one, perhaps if you're looking for something a little bit more lightweight, like a mini bobber or a cruiser, then this might just fit the bill.
Sponsored by McCams, getting you back on two wheels when it wasn't your fault.